Bible College campus. I have now been called a nut by President Loper. No, it was all good, and I appreciate that. I taught for years in Bible colleges, and I miss it sometimes. And it's great to see all these high schoolers. I taught in high school, too, for a long time, and sometimes I miss that for a few seconds. But it is great to be here. And as Brother Loper mentioned, I work with Evangelistic Faith Missions and Holiness Pilgrim Mission, and I get to be a lot of places and eat strange food and travel in unusual ways. It's a lot of fun. I'm not going to talk about missions a lot today, but it is a privilege to share with you, and anyone who is planning or contemplating being a missionary in the future, we can connect you with the action. So be glad to talk to you anytime. I'd like to read from Acts chapter 26, just a couple of verses, 4 verses total, I believe, 4 verses. And this is Paul's testimony to King Agrippa, and he's talking about his encounter with Christ on the road to Damascus and the things that Jesus said to him. Acts chapter 26, beginning with verse 16. But rise and stand upon thy feet, for I have appeared unto thee for this purpose, to make thee a minister and a witness both of these things which thou hast seen, and of those things in the which I will appear unto thee, delivering thee from the people and from the Gentiles unto whom now I send thee, to open their eyes and to turn them from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan unto God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and inheritance among them which are sanctified by faith that is in me. Whereupon, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient unto the heavenly vision. Paul testifies here of a very dramatic conversion and call. And in his case, they happened at the same time. He was converted by his encounter with Christ, and he heard the call that God gave him to ministry. And while much of that is in these verses, we could say applies to all Christians in general, in the sense that we are all called to make a spiritual impact. We are all called to, by our testimony and our witness, to help turn people from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God. Yet it's undeniable that Paul did get a call here to some very specific ministry, a great future that God had for him. Now, when we talk about calls, we've all heard the stories of how various people have been called into ministry. Charles Finney, if you ever read his autobiography, I read that very early in my ministry, and is very exciting to me. He was a lawyer and a skeptic for a while, but he got saved. And the morning he got saved, he out praying out somewhere, he rushed back into town with a call to preach, and he actually was supposed to be in court that morning. And we met his client. He informed his client, sorry, I'm not going to court. I've been called to preach, and that's all I'm going to do from now on. And the guy went rushing off to find another lawyer. Now, I'm not saying that God expected him to not fulfill his obligations that he had already formed for that day, at least, but that was how enthusiastic his response was to the call of God. Faith Himmeter, who is legendary in EFM history, was called to God, I believe it was when she was 9 years old, when she was called to ministry, and she was praying to be sanctified at an altar, and God spoke to her and asked her if she would be a missionary. And she answered that call, and later went on to serve several decades on the field. And I want to talk a little bit today about following God's direction. And I don't know if this is a sermon or what you would call it. I'm not really going to expound the scripture that I read, so it's not that. But I want to talk about following God's direction, and I'll tell you some stories about that and give you some points. I actually have 14 points. If you want to write them down, I'll try to let you know when I come to them. Most of them I won't have the chance to talk to very much. But, we're all interested in the future because we all hope to be there. And, things are changing so rapidly. The future is not what it used to be, someone has said. And with the work of diligent historians, the past is not what it used to be either. But at your stage, you're more looking forward, you're more thinking about the future than you are the past. I grew up in a pastor's home, and my dad pastored a series of churches as I was growing up. And some of the things that impressed upon me as principles in following God's direction, finding the will of God, was first of all that following God's will was the absolute priority, and that you should follow God's will wherever it leads. And that's my point number one, is to follow God's will wherever it leads. And so my dad was always ready if he felt like God told him that he was done in a place and that he should move to a different ministry. He was always ready to do that no matter what it meant that he would leave behind. And so I grew up with that consciousness that the call of God might take me anywhere. And that was before I had a clear sense of what God's call would be. But I always knew that God's call could take me anywhere and that it was not negotiable. It didn't matter whether you owned a house. It didn't matter whether you had a business. It didn't matter whether all your cousins live on the road that you live on. None of that could be in conflict with following the will of God wherever it leads. Another one was trusting God to provide. You know, it's interesting that finances were never a factor in my dad's decisions of where he was going to minister. He never moved anywhere because of what they paid. I don't know, in some cases, if he knew what they were going to pay, and sometimes it was very small. But finances were not a factor in discerning the will of God. He trusted God to provide. And I'm not saying to be irresponsible, but God will provide where he leads you. And then the third was to live sacrificially. So trusting God to provide doesn't mean necessarily that you will drive a Corvette. And so you live sacrificially, and there were times we did. But you know, when we talk about God providing, we really do mean that God provides. We don't mean that you are on a starvation diet. We don't mean that your needs are not met. We mean that they are met. And as we grew up, I'm amazed now when I think back at the income that we must have been living on, how incredibly low it was, but we never knew, us kids growing up, we never knew we were poor because God provided. We had everything we needed. We ate great food. My mom cooked for camps even sometimes. And at Christmas time, there was a pile of gifts under the tree. And we grew up without any consciousness of being poor. Even though my parents lived sacrificially, God provided. And I remember early on, I had a sense that God was going to call me to ministry. I just had this sense, and it wasn't definite, it wasn't clear, but just this inclination, I don't know what, just a tendency, and just knowing that that's probably what God was going to lead me to. But it wasn't definite in my mind. But as time went on, I really was focused that direction. And I remember the time came when I had to know for sure. I had graduated from high school. I graduated a little bit early. And my mom thought I was too young, not mature enough to go to college. I thought I was, but she didn't think I was. So they kept me at home, and I did another year. I did a year's work of college remotely. There weren't a lot of options for that back then, but we found one. And so I worked on college. But as we came close to the end of that, it's like, okay, I've got to say what I'm going to do. You know, I've got to, what do I do next? And so I realized, okay, I'm going to have to really be clear. And so I remember one night I knelt by my bed. My dad was pastoring in Marshall, Illinois, and I got down on my knees, and my prayer was really just about this simple. Just, Lord, I'm coming to the end of this year, and I need to know what I'm going to do. And if you want me to preach, I just need to know for sure. Do you want me to preach? And I just waited for the answer. And I got it. I just felt a confirmation, just as definite as anything could be. And I didn't see a vision. I didn't hear any audible sounds. I just knew. I knew beyond any doubt. And God is able to make his will known. He really is. He's able to make his will known. And whenever God does not speak clearly, he expects us to follow the principles that we understand. And a lot of times people are sitting around waiting for God to tell them to do something. Well, you already know he doesn't want you to be sitting around. I mean, you already are not following God's direction if you're not doing anything. Do something, And if God wants you to do something unusual, something that you would not arrive at by just the general principles, then he can show you that. Amen? There's a lot of wisdom right there. I appreciate the amens from these folks back here. They have a lot of experience in trying to guide young people. And I remember, I didn't tell my parents for a while, though. I waited till as long as I possibly could, because my dad, I'd heard him talk about how when he got his call to preach at age 12, he told his dad, who was a pastor, and his dad had him preach the next Sunday. And so I thought he would do the same thing to me. I'd heard him mention that a couple of times. So I thought, as soon as I tell him I've got a call to preach, he's going to have me preach. Well, I didn't feel ready, and so I put it off as long as I could. But it came down to where, okay, we got to make we got to make plans, do applications and stuff for the next year. So I finally told him I've got a call to preach. Well, he didn't have me to do it right away, but the time did come up fairly soon. And he asked me to preach on a Sunday night, I believe it was. Might have been a Wednesday. Yeah, it was a Sunday night. Because I remember all afternoon pacing back and forth in my room, praying and going over my points and what I was going to say. And that night, as I sat in the congregation waiting to preach, there were 2 verses on the scripture on the wall, and one of them said, "He it is that doth go with thee." And I read that over and over and trying to encourage myself that God was going to help me with this. And I got up and I preached on prayer. And I said everything that I thought was important to say about prayer. I still remember a couple of those points from that sermon, and it was 7 minutes long. And that was my main concern had been, am I a real preacher? Can I really get up and really preach? And is it going to be so short that it will be embarrassing? Well, that was all I could think of to say. I mean, praying about it for for hours and thinking and everything. 7 minutes is all I came up with. And yeah, it was a little embarrassing that it was so short. But man, that was the scariest thing just about that I have ever done. I had made a graduation speech when I graduated. I was the valedictorian because I was the whole class. And so my mom found me a pre-written speech somewhere, about a 3 or 4 minute speech. And it was just this, thing about, new day, beginning and commencement stuff, And she had me memorize that. I don't know why. I mean, why couldn't I just have read it? I don't know. But she said I had to memorize it. And so that was the scariest thing I had ever done up to that point, because I knew public speaking was not my thing. I was terrified of that. And so I memorized that to where I could have said it in my sleep, because I knew I was going to be really nervous. And I got up there, I stammered a couple times, but I got through it. But then to prepare something of my own with the help of God and preach, that was another whole level. And so I really kind of passed a milestone to do that 7 minute sermon. Now, just to mention, and I don't know if anybody here would consider yourself an introvert. You don't have to raise your hand. But I was an introvert. Now, and I still am an introvert. Now, being an introvert doesn't necessarily mean that you're shy. Now, there are people around here that are experts on all this stuff. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're shy or that you don't like people, that you don't have fun with people, that you don't want a social life and all that. It doesn't necessarily mean all that. But for me, it did. I was the shyest person that you have ever met. Whatever person here is shy, I probably was worse. And people who are not, they do not understand the agony of being literally painfully shy. And just to give you an idea, when I was so self-conscious that if I would meet somebody and say hi, as I would go on, I would wonder if my voice sounded right, or if I had the right expression. And I was so self-conscious and not taking to social kind of things. That's how shy I was. My first semester at Bible college, I did not say anything in class the whole semester. I did not ask a question. I did not raise my hand. I did not make a comment. And I think the second semester, the first time I spoke was when a teacher called on me to make me say something because he noticed that I hadn't said anything all semester. So that's how I was. So some of these people that people say, "Oh yeah, you can tell he's going to be a preacher. I mean, look at him." Nobody ever said that about me. In fact, my relatives, my cousin, when we would go to family reunion, I would take books. Okay, so we're getting together with all my cousins. Most of them were, most of my uncles were Nazarene preachers, and a lot of my aunts had married Nazarene preachers. And I had all these cousins. They were all very loud. Most of them were girls. Most of them a few years older than I, about my sister's age. And they would play games like Pit and other noisy kind of games and stuff like that. And I would take books. Literally, I would take books, and I would go find a quiet corner and read books at family reunion. And when we would visit somebody, my family, we'd happen to be visiting some other family, I would hope that they did not have kids my age, because then I could sit in the living room and not have to say anything, just listen to the adults talk. So you get some idea of where I'm coming from and what it meant for me to say that I had a call to preach. You understand? And so youth camps and all this, I did well in the quiz things, memorizing things and stuff like that. Athletics, I was average or sometimes less. And anything that required social stuff, I was almost not present. And so that's where I was coming from. But when my dad asked me to preach that sermon, it didn't even occur to me to say no. It didn't even occur to me to think about it. To me, I had the assumption that if you're called to do it and you're asked to do it, you do it. I think that's a pretty good assumption, really. And that's my fourth point is don't say no to ministry opportunities. And especially if it's in the area of your calling. I mean, I wouldn't have thought that I had the right to say no. Now, I know that there comes a time when there are so many open doors, you can't take everything. You can't do everything anybody asks you to do. But I think a general principle is start in your early years, you do what you're asked to do. You take that as a ministry opportunity that God brought to you. And for one thing, you don't know what you're going to be good at this point until you try some things. Some of your talents show, and some of them don't show, and some will never show unless you try to do some of those things. Well, I went to UBC. That's another Bible college over in Indiana, and not referred to as the Hilltop. And when I didn't really pray about it much because my sister had gone there, and it was the only one I was really familiar with, and I didn't even pray really about whether I should go to Bible college. And by the way, if you're called to ministry, I doubt that you need to pray about whether you should go to Bible college. Now, that may be a surprise to you, but there's some things you don't need to pray about very much, okay? When you wake up on Sunday morning, you don't need to pray about whether to go to church or not, okay? When you wake up on any other morning, you don't need to pray about whether you should go to class or not, right? Or whether to take your exam. You don't need to pray about those things. You already know what God's will is for you. And I assumed Bible college was just about that solid, that I should go to Bible college. And you don't need me to tell you that since you're already here, except the high school students. But if God calls you to ministry, you probably need to be in Bible college. And it's okay to pray about which one. I really didn't, but I think God took me to the right place. And I didn't feel ready. And see, when I got there, okay, I already mentioned I was young. I was younger than anybody else in college. And here were these other guys. They'd already preached. And some of them even were in their mid-20s. Maybe they didn't get saved as young, and they get saved, and they're called to preach, and they're all fired up. And when they come to Bible college, they've already preached 50 times, and they're just chomping at the bit. They're just hoping somebody will give them a chance, to preach anywhere. Well, I wanted to be that way, but I was not. I did not feel ready. I didn't feel like I was a real preacher. I had preached one time. Now, looking back, it would have been good if my dad had had me preach a few more times, but I had preached one time, a 7-minute message on prayer, And so I remember one chapel, they said, okay, sometimes we get calls, people call in here and they've got a pastor who's sick or away or whatever, and they need somebody to come preach. And so we need a list of guys that are able, with your phone numbers, if you are available to preach, if we get a call, you need to come over after chapel and sign up over here. And I went. But man, only those of you who are very shy can imagine how I felt to go over there and sign up. I had preached one 7-minute sermon, and it's like, okay, what's it going to be like if somebody calls in here and I happen to get sent out? Well, that fear did not come to pass for some time until one time on a Wednesday night, and I don't know, probably they were scraping the bottom of the barrel. I don't know. But they said, we need somebody to go over and preach at the Wesleyan Church in Summitville. Pastor's away. And so I rode over with a couple students and preached at Summitville. I preached for 15 minutes on the life of Samson. So I doubled my time, a little more, doubled my time. And I preached on the life of Samson. And I didn't feel like it went great. I kind of got through it. And afterwards, and one thing that bothered me, and see, this kind of thing, it shouldn't bother us, but it does. I knew that there was a young man in that church who's a very outgoing kind of guy. He was also going to UBC, and getting up front was never a problem for him. Getting him to be quiet was a challenge. And so I thought, I'm going to go preach in this place where this guy is from. You know what I mean? And that bothered me. That made me feel kind of self-conscious. And afterwards, an old lady came up to me and she said, son, how old are you? And I told her. And she said, well, you're not doing too bad then. And so that was my encouragement. And it didn't help me feel a lot better, but I guess a couple impressions that I got during my time of UBC, though, was number 5 of my points: keep spiritual victory the absolute priority. And they had a quotation on the wall by Simeon Smith, a former president. He said, if your zeal for learning exceeds your zeal for souls, stop and pray until your zeal for souls exceeds your zeal for learning. So, and now I don't know if in these days or in those days for that matter, if anybody struggles with an excessive zeal for learning. Most of the time we're having to try to increase that, not suppress it. But the point that I got from that is that ministry is the focus, and that's number 6. Keep a ministry focus in all your decisions, and that included any ambitions that you have, who you marry, everything. You keep a ministry focus. I am here to prepare for ministry, and I don't bring anything into my life. I don't make any decisions. I don't borrow money that I don't have to. I don't encumber myself. I don't start a lifestyle that I will not be able to continue when I get into ministry, because ministry is my focus. I was inspired by reading about Finney and David Brainerd and others. And even though I was just getting started and did not feel like my abilities were there much at all, my 7th principle is don't settle for routine. I had made up my mind I was never just going to fill a position somewhere. And failure is not an option. I like that expression. I had in my mind, we are going to go out there and we're going to do something to impact the world. And wherever God puts me, and it may not be in a dramatic way. I didn't know what I would be doing. I didn't know, the places that I would serve. But I decided wherever I am, whatever I'm doing, I'm never just going to be punching the time clock. And there's nothing wrong with having a time clock. I'm talking about you don't settle, you don't think you're doing your job just because you were punching the time clock. Just because you were showing up and sitting behind the right desk and you're there. And I've known so many pastors that they pastored for 20 years as the church steadily, slowly declined, and then finally they leave before it gasps its last gasp and closes. And they punched the time clock for 20 years is what they did. And you don't see them, and I know there are lots of factors, and God understands and all that, but you don't see them really in anxiety about it. It's not like, oh man, I had 19 people for 2 years, and now I've got 17 people, and nobody got saved in my church last year, and no visitor has walked in for 6 months. You don't see them in anxiety about that. I know there can be many reasons why that could be the case, but why not have some anxiety about it, some concern about it? Don't settle for routine. I never considered quitting. I never considered quitting Bible college. Now, some people quit. People quit for different reasons. One is bad grades or struggles or whatever. And I had a roommate. He was flunking all of his classes. At first, I was kind of looking at his notes to kind of compare and see how I should be doing mine. But I asked him one day, "What'd you get on your notebook before?" And he said an F. So I thought, I'm looking at the wrong guy's notebook. And he did later go on and finish Bible college in another place. And most of you would know who he is if I said his name. But I didn't consider quitting because of discouragement, and I also didn't consider quitting because of zeal to get out there and get started. See, because some people say, well, man, the world's going to hell, and we need to get out there and share the gospel. Well, there's nobody that cares more about, I shouldn't say that. Nobody cares more about it than I do. But it is something that I think about every day, and I work at this every day. The idea and the work of getting the gospel extended to some places. So that's very close to my heart. But don't shortcut your training. And that's the point. Number 8, don't shortcut your training. And something that goes with that, invest early. It will never be easier to do it than it is now. These people that say, I'm going to take a year off, doing what? I mean, what are you going to do? I'm going to go get a job at McDonald's. I'm going to relax, kind of get my mind in focus. Okay, I'm not saying that's never right, but I think mostly it's almost never right. Invest early. Get your training in as early as you can. I worked on the work program. I cleaned. Back then, they had just guys clean the guys' dorms, and so I did that. I worked at McDonald's some. That was one of the places I was called slow one time, and not slow in speed, slow mentally. Now, that's not something that happened to me all that often, but we're all kind of smart in different areas. You know what I mean? And figuring out mechanics and technical things and stuff, I'm learning a lot these days. I just got an iPhone 15 and I like it. I'm learning how to do this kind of stuff. But that stuff did not come quickly to me. And when I started at McDonald's and they would show me how to do this registering, all these buttons and stuff, and especially when somebody would come and say, I want a hamburger with no onions. Well, you had to hit all these extra buttons to make that, you couldn't just say hamburger with no onions. You had to enter it in. And so I'd ask a manager, okay, how do you do a hamburger with no onions? And they're in a hurry, they don't really want to teach you. They just come over and boop, 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 and off they go. And I don't know what they did. And so by the time I got to where I was trying to ask different managers how to do it so that the same one didn't know that I had asked 3 times, but you couldn't always manage that. And one of them said, are you slow or what? Well, I didn't even try to answer that. But number 9 is do any kind of work needed. Don't consider any work beneath you. I cleaned, I mopped, and I didn't enjoy all that stuff. I didn't enjoy all the people I worked with. But do whatever because you've got a goal, all right? You don't do the work because you like it. Man, I see kids quit work because they don't like it. Well, okay, someday you want to be in something that you love and is fulfilling, but that's probably not going to be right now. You do whatever you have to do right now to get your, whatever the hourly rate is these days, and to make it to your goal. I met Stephanie. She didn't like me much at first. And that was the most social effort I had ever made. When I met Stephanie, I talked to her more than I had ever talked to anybody, except maybe my brother and sister. But she was a receptionist, and she would answer the phone, and so I would go and loiter in the lobby and talk to her. And we have 6 children and a bunch of grandchildren now. There's a lot of interesting stuff there, but I can't tell you that story. But number 10 is get the right partner or none. Okay? Get the right partner or none. And if you don't have a good prospect that's a good partner, then just leave it in God's hands and wait. Because it's better to have the right partner or have none than to have someone who will be a burden on your ministry, detract from your ministry for the rest of your life. Now, in our we got into our last year of Bible college, trying to think, okay, what are we going to do? And I had always just assumed I'm going to be a pastor. I'm going to pastor a church. And so began to think, okay, and I was Pilgrim Holiness. Brother Sutherland was the conference president at that time. And so they said, we've got a little church down in Kentucky that needs a pastor. And so can you go down, would you be interested in going down and try out? I had given Brother Sutherland my name. I'm going to graduate this year. I'm open for a church. So I took Stephanie and another student, had to have chaperone, but I took her with me because we were engaged to be married. And so we went down there, and I preached Sunday morning and Sunday night in this little church. Now, they had their pastor had, I think, died, and they were without a pastor, but they had a 16-year-old boy that was his grandson who had a call to preach, and he was filling in. And they thought he was doing a great job. I mean, this 16-year-old boy, he had never been, of course, to Bible college or had much training, but he'd grown up somewhat in the church, and he had a gift for preaching, and he's actually an evangelist today. Most of you probably would know who he is. So I preached morning and evening, and I didn't feel like I did real great, and so I wasn't real surprised when they called Brother Sutherland and they said that for now they're just going to stick with the 16-year-old boy that they had filling in rather than have me come. And so looking back, I wasn't necessarily feeling that was where I should go, and I took that as confirmation that it was not where I should go. And looking back, I realized definitely God was guiding, and that was not the place to go. But what that meant was, so we graduated on a Saturday from Bible college in 1988, and we got married the next Saturday. Now, I hear about people who they spend months preparing their weddings, and I don't know what all that is, what all goes into that. Obviously, I didn't do much of it, and Stephanie did most of the work on that. But we graduated on a Saturday, got married the next Saturday, and it was exciting. And we did not know where we were going to live, and I did not have a job. Neither of us had a job. And so can you imagine getting married, and we have no address to go to. We have nowhere to go to after we get married except our honeymoon. So we took our honeymoon and we had no money either. We had no savings. And so we used the money that we got as wedding gifts and took our honeymoon without knowing what house we were going to come back to after our honeymoon. Now, I'm not going to give you a numbered principle on that, okay? I'm not saying that is the way to do it. And I had previously, Don Nichols at Lima had sent a message that they needed teachers at their school. Well, I just dismissed it. I didn't really think about it because I was kind of thinking in this rut, I'm going to be a pastor. I'm going to go be a pastor. And he wanted an associate pastor too, but I thought, I'm going to be a pastor. I don't want to be an associate pastor. And so we went to Pilgrim Camp then after our honeymoon. So we had another week of a place to stay, which was a camper. And during that time, Brother Nichols talked to me, and I began to feel like, okay, I should consider this. And point number 11 is consider open doors. Consider open doors. Now, that doesn't mean that just any opportunity that happens to arise is what you ought to do, but you should take open doors seriously, because I think God shows his direction through that a lot of the time. And there have been a lot of times that the open doors kind of challenged my assumptions of what I was going to do. And one of them was at that time I thought I'd go pastor a little church somewhere. Well, I realize now that would not have been good for me, and I would not have been good for a church. I had a lot of growing up to do, and I thought I was pretty much ready. I mean, I'd been through all these years of Bible college. I had all this knowledge and everything, and I thought that I was full of ideas. You know, I was full of ideas of how it ought to be done. But I wasn't ready. And so I'm going to just jump through next years. We served at Lima. Then we went down to Mississippi to attend seminary, and I taught in a little school down there. And one of the ladies, Mrs. Patterson, that worked in the school, this was Mississippi, okay? I don't know, anybody here from Mississippi or Georgia or Alabama? Okay, I don't see any hands. Nobody from down there? Okay, I see a few. That's great. Different culture to some extent. And Ms. Patterson said one time, she said, I've never known anybody from up north before. But after getting acquainted with you guys, I don't think I'd want to live up there. Well, that was, that kind of went down with some of the other compliments or encouragements that I've gotten over the years. But, I had so much to learn about adjusting to people and adapting and so on. And so the time came, I went back, we went and worked at another school. I taught at UBC. We went to Ukraine, and that's the call to Ukraine. We need to do a sequel someday, because I haven't even gotten to some of the best stories, and it's 5 to 12. But considering the open doors, number 12 is work with zeal and determination. And I don't really have time to talk about that one. Number 13, lead through relationship. And then the last one is number 14, observe providential confirmations. And I want to talk about those two for just a couple minutes. Lead through relationship. See, I told you I was an introvert, and my idea was you learn how to do it. And I'd rather learn it from a book than have anybody show me. I'd rather learn from a book than work. I didn't want to work with a team. If I know how to do it, I'll just do it, and a team's just going to get in the way. I mean, those are all ways that I approached it. Well, those are not good approaches for a leader to make. If you're a leader, you've got to influence others. Your goal is not just to do the job yourself, but to accomplish a greater job by having people work together. And I began to realize, that old saying, they don't care how much you know till they know how much you care. When I pastored in the inner city, they didn't know that I had a doctor's degree. They didn't know about any of that, and they would have barely understood what that even meant. If I'd have told them that, or books that I had been a part of, that didn't mean 2 cents to them. But when I sat with them in the hospitals, when I came to their house after they'd had break-ins or a fire, I pastored in the inner city, by the way, so we had plenty of situations like that to respond to. All kinds of issues. Had kids come and stay in our house for days at a time and things like that. Well, after that, they were glad to also know that I had all this knowledge and everything, because I was using it for them. And so, after they know you care, they're glad you know some things too. Right? They're glad you know some things too. They were kind of proud that our pastor is, educated or whatever. Still, they probably didn't know what a doctor's degree was, but but it didn't matter till they knew that I cared. And I learned you have to lead by relationship. When I went to help start a school in Oklahoma, I went in there conscious that I had grown up in this system of ACE, and I know how to do it, and I've been to the training, and I know how to do it. I was in it for years, and so I'm going to tell them how to do it. And so they were used to, okay, we're going to talk about how to do things. Well, no, we don't need to talk about how we do things. There's a set way to do it, and I know what it is, so I can tell you, And I realize now I could have done that much differently and lead by relationship instead. Observe providential confirmations is my last one. And, a good friend of mine, Tim Keefe, that many of you would know, he wrote an article one time about finding God's will, and he made the statement in there, don't wait. He said, in fact, he made it stronger, refuse to wait for a miracle. And when I read that, I thought, really? But I read it and I had to agree, because there are a lot of people sitting around waiting for a providential thing, waiting for God to confirm it by a miracle, like Gideon saying, Lord, okay, make the towel wet and the ground dry, or then make the ground wet and the towel dry. And God has to send him down to hear somebody tell about their dream and all this stuff to get him to move, And most people, if that stuff hasn't happened, they're not moving. They're waiting for God to do amazing things. Well, the scripture seems to indicate that God does amazing things as you are moving. It says these signs shall follow those that believe. It doesn't say they're following as God's opening these amazing things in front of them, they walk into it. No, God is doing amazing things as they're walking into it, and not everything goes well. Open doors are great, but most things worthwhile are not going to just click and fall into place. Now, what you can see is some providential confirmations as you're on the way. So you're in the struggle, you're having all these setbacks, you're having all these problems, but you can see where God is doing some things. And that's like, okay, wow, God's helping me. I'm doing the right thing. Now, you don't wait for that. You don't wait for signs and confirmations. Again, follow the general principles of God, unless God shows you something specific, and follow that specific thing. And God will give providential confirmations along the way. And you've heard many people tell about the answers to prayer, whether it's financial needs, other kinds of things, where God just opened the doors, and sometimes very little things, sometimes very big things, that are just the little signs that God is helping us. God's on our side. And it doesn't mean it's going to be an easy ride. You read the Bible, look at the life of the Apostle Paul and see that it wasn't an easy ride. But God opens the door. A great door and effectual is set before us, as he said. Well, it's a privilege to share with you this morning, and may God bless you and guide you in all that you do for him. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Gibson, and that was excellent, and appreciate his ministry and the emphasis on practical things this morning. Let's stand together. Father, thank you for your blessings on us. Be with us as we go our way. Give us a great weekend of ministry and relaxation in Jesus' name. Amen. You're dismissed.